Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute. Just a typical kind of summer week here in Washington. Seriously, we're all aware of the president announcing that he will not be running for re-election. We see the emergence of the vice president, Kamala Harris, as a leading person to replace the president as the Democratic nominee. We just seen the Republican convention last week, and it gets to the question of this nexus between policy and politics. From our perspective at the Washington Institute, we're curious, of course, about the U.S. role in the Middle East, and it comes at a week that Israeli Prime Minister Binyamin Netanyahu is visiting. He will be making his fourth speech to a joint session of Congress. It happens the most of any leader. His idol, iconic Winston Churchill, only had three, and one of them was as a private citizen. But the prime minister will be meeting now. It's been confirmed with President Biden, who's recovering from corona. He's coming back from his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, to the White House, and they're going to be meeting on Thursday. He will also be meeting, the prime minister will be meeting with Vice President Harris as well. This is prime minister's, though, first time at the White House, even though he's been a veteran, used to come here more semi-annually. But while the president and the prime minister have met at the UN General Assembly this past September, and famously, President Biden flew to Israel, the first president to fly to Israel during wartime after the October 7th massacres. But it's the prime minister's first time at the White House under his new government since his coalition was formed in December 2022. So there's a lot to talk about on this intersection between policy and politics during this very eventful week here in Washington. And I'm just so delighted that we have really three people who I think could really speak to the moment we're in and look at future trajectories. I'm very delighted that we're joined here by Morgan Vinya. She's the former Vice President for Government Affairs at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, JINSA, and from 2019 to 2021. Morgan served in the Department of Defense, the DoD, as Chief of Staff for International Security Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And prior to her time at DoD, Morgan also served as Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor to the UN Permanent Representative Nikki Haley. Also delighted to be joined by a veteran presence here in Washington, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat. He has served in prominent roles in no less than 6 U.S. administrations, including as former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, and Chief White House Domestic Advisor, Policy Advisor to President Carter. He was also Special Advisor to 3 successive administrations on Holocaust issues, and is the author of the just published book, The Art of Diplomacy, How American negotiators reached historic agreements that changed the world. And of course, our own Ambassador Dennis Ross. He's the Institute's counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow. For more than 12 years, Dennis played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, and was the U.S. point man on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations during the period of George H.W. Bush and the Bill Clinton administration. Dennis also formerly served as a special assistant to President Obama. Dennis is also the author of many books, including 2 that we co-wrote together. So I'm just delighted for this panel. I think it's going to be very, very informative, and I want to thank you all for joining us. And Morgan, why don't we start with you to kick us off today?
David, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you so much to the Washington Institute for having me today. So, to say that Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit comes at a dynamic time in U.S. politics is an understatement. This month, we have truly seen an unprecedented set of events take place. I think I speak for everyone when I say that the word unprecedented is often overused, but in this case, it's quite apt. It's worth mentioning that Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit was originally scheduled to be in March. Of course, he pulled that down when the United States refused to veto and, in fact, voted in favor of a UN Security Council resolution that called for a ceasefire in Gaza without the precondition of returning of hostages. This was a significant shift in U.S. policy, of course. And so it was an interesting turn of events, though, when in May, congressional leaders invited the prime minister to address Congress. This included Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who in March had called for new elections in Israel and encouraged Israelis to reject Netanyahu's leadership. So fast forward to the here and now. Netanyahu comes to the United States at a time when Americans' attention is really focused on domestic politics rather than U.S. engagement overseas. This was really kickstarted with President Biden's disastrous debate against former President Donald Trump. And basically everyone on the left essentially called for President Biden to withdraw from the race. Of course, then we saw the shocking assassination attempt on Donald Trump, followed by the RNC convention and the nomination of the party for J.D. Vance, Senator J.D. Vance, to be the vice president. Biden then, as David noted, caught coronavirus and shortly later this weekend dropped out of the race, endorsing Vice President Harris. And so now we are off to the races with a visit by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Am I forgetting anything, gentlemen? So as for Bibi's visit and who he's likely to meet with while he's here, as with many foreign visits, I think a lot was up in the air until most recently. What we know is that of last night, President Biden will meet with the prime minister likely on Thursday. That is also likely when Vice President Harris is to have a one-on-one with Netanyahu as well. I think notably, Vice President Harris will not preside over the congressional address in her capacity as pro tempore of the Senate. This is, I find, quite disappointing and something that I'm sure we'll all be able to unpack in the Q&A. I'll say it has been no secret that Vice President Harris has been more forward-leaning than her boss on calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. I think you'll recall that the White House had to actually walk back some of her comments earlier this year when she got a bit over her skis calling for a ceasefire. But nevertheless, I think it's pretty clear that Vice President Harris is definitely more of a critic on Israel on what she perceives as Netanyahu's heavy-handedness and her compassion and her empathy when it comes to the humanitarian plight of Palestinian civilians. So as for Congress, I don't think it's much of a surprise that we are going to definitely see members boycott the address. Of course, the squad, no surprise there. But I think what you'll also tend to see is a lot of Democrats in the Senate side. Specifically, Elizabeth Warner has come out, member of the House Armed Services Committee, saying that she will not attend the address. But also Brian Schatz, someone of the Jewish faith, has also said that he is not going to attend the address either. It's highly likely that we'll also see a number of senators and members of Congress not attend. With that said, though, I don't think we are necessarily expecting it's going to be a different type of reaction this time around than what we saw in 2015 when many Democrats boycotted Prime Minister Netanyahu's address as they saw it undermined the JCPOA negotiations. So they saw that as a slap in the face to Obama, whereas now it's much more of a very sort of personal rebuke of Netanyahu. As for Netanyahu's remarks, he will need to remind Congress and the American public why the Middle East matters, and more specifically, why Israel matters to the United States. As Jake Sullivan says, he does not expect a repeat of the 2015 speech, but rather this is likely to be one that inspires U.S.-Israeli unity against common threats, whether it be terrorism, nuclear war, the like. I do think it would be smart for Bibi to remind Congress that the United States is under constant threat of Iranian terrorism. Of course, it was only last week when Iranian-backed proxies attacked U.S. forces in Iraq after about 3 months of relative quiet. And so I think this really is a demonstration that Iranian proxies will only pull back when it is convenient for them to do so, and that they nevertheless can strike when they wish. As such, I think it would be important for Prime Minister Netanyahu to stress in his meetings with Speaker Johnson and other members of Congress that in order for Israel to win this now multi-front war, Israel will need to continue to seek U.S. support, whether it be in the form of information sharing, intel sharing, arms, munitions, the like. I think it's also important to mention that Israel's security has also benefited greatly from the Abraham Accords. Under the Biden administration, there has been a major push to bring Saudi Arabia into the fold. Riyadh, of course, wants security guarantees, primarily Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, wants those guarantees in the form of a treaty. Speaking favorably to senators of a treaty with Saudi Arabia couldn't hurt to further this process along. I think another option, of course, is calling for Netanyahu to call for a narrow mutual defense pact between the United States and Israel, which, of course, Jinsa has been a major proponent of. This has often been discussed, including by the Hill, specifically Senator Lindsey Graham, but it hasn't really been followed up on since it was first mentioned during the Trump administration. Clearly, there is existing heartburn both at the Pentagon and in Israel regarding a mutual defense pact, but I definitely think it's something that is worth having a conversation about and would be have a useful deterrent effect. Ultimately, though, Netanyahu will need to emphasize that October 7th fundamentally reshaped the fabric of the Middle East. There's no going back on this. Israel's deterrence must be reestablished, and it's not going to happen without U.S. resolute support. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you very much. Over to you, Stu.
Thank you, David. It's difficult to think of a more politically fraught time for the Prime Minister of Israel to address a joint session of Congress in the midst of an intense presidential election. For many decades after its founding, Israel was a uniting political issue on the right and left. Unfortunately, it's now become one of the most divisive foreign policy issues. U.S. views on Israel dramatically diverge along partisan and age lines. Republicans have a much more favorable view of Israel than Democrats do. Older Americans of both parties have more positive views of Israel than younger voters, and indeed, troubling, a significant majority, 56% in some polls, of young adults under 30 have an unfavorable view of Israel. While older Americans express more positive views toward Israel than toward the Palestinians, younger U.S. adults under 30 view the Palestinians more favorably than the Israeli people. This political and age divide has grown larger since the Gaza war began. A recent Gallup poll found that a majority of Americans disapprove of America's actions in Gaza. Only 36% approve. All three political groups, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, have seen drops in approval since the war began, but it's much more pronounced among Democrats, with 75% of Democrats disapproving, while 2/3 of Republicans still approve. This has been aggravated by the most conservative government in Israeli history. The Prime Minister has become a divisive figure. In 2015, he addressed a joint session at the invitation of a Republican speaker without a prior approval of President Obama, and used the platform to sharply criticize the emerging nuclear agreement with Iran, which the Obama administration was seeking to conclude. Only recently, just in the last few weeks, the Prime Minister publicly blamed the president for not providing Israel with the military equipment and ammunition needed for Israel to defeat Hamas, notwithstanding the fact that President Biden has been staunchly supportive of Israel's actions against Hamas, even at the expense of losing political support among young minority and progressive Democrats. And as Morgan mentioned, Vice President Harris has decided not to preside over a joint session, something usually done, which is unfortunate. Deeply troubling and unprecedented in the midst of a war of self-defense by Israel. After the accidental Israeli airstrike, which killed 7 World Kitchen Aid workers, 55 House Democrats, including staunch pro-Israel supporters for decades like Nancy Pelosi and my own congressman from Montgomery County, Jamie Raskin, signed a letter asking the president to withhold the new arms package to Israel and any further offensive arms transfers until a full investigation was completed. And if that finding was that there was a violation of either U.S. or international law, to continue to withhold transfers until those responsible were held accountable, and even more broadly, to withhold arms transfers if Israel, quote, fails to sufficiently mitigate harm to innocent civilians in Gaza. So what unifying message of hope will the Prime Minister deliver tomorrow to heal these partisan divisions from Israel's major ally and signal a way of ending the conflict in Gaza and achieving a post-war governance and security structure? I fervently wish that we could teach the student campus demonstrators, some of whom I have personally seen, and Hamas sympathizers, including, by the way, many faculty members, of the repeated Palestinian rejections of generous offers of land for peace in a Palestinian state by Israeli prime ministers over many decades. But that was then, Gaza is now. Israel is now fighting its longest war since its War of Independence. My view is that Hamas must be disabled as a military and governing organization in Gaza. It's a terrorist group that instigated the worst single-day slaughter of Jews on October 7th since the Holocaust. It did so not to achieve a political objective, but to eliminate Israel as a Jewish state. No government can permit a government or party on its borders to be committed to its extermination with the means of doing so. Sadly, however, Israel ignored many of the lessons I learned from interviews I conducted of leading U.S. generals and political leaders involved in wars in which the U.S. has been fighting or supporting in our lifetime. For my new book, The Art of Diplomacy, which David mentioned. These lessons are first, accurate intelligence is essential to understand the enemy, their capabilities, history, and culture. Israeli intelligence and the strategy that followed failed the Israeli people. The Israeli government consciously weakened the already weak Palestinian Authority, which was at least committed to a two-state solution, permitted Qatar and others to support Hamas, believing they could domesticate Hamas, and allowed Hamas to grow from a terrorist group into a full-fledged terrorist army, well-trained, well-armed by Iran. Junior intelligence officers had the full battle plan for October 7, but the Israeli intelligence leadership didn't believe Hamas had the ability to carry it out. A second lesson is to have a reasonably achievable military objective. But the Israeli government had the goal of, quote unquote, total victory, rather than a goal of preventing Hamas from regrouping and maintaining power. The IDF's own top spokesman, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, recently said that the stated goal of the war to destroy Hamas was not possible, and I quote him, "To maintain that is like throwing sand in the eyes of the public. Hamas is an idea. Anyone who thinks we can eliminate Hamas is wrong. The political echelon needs to find an alternative." A remarkable statement. Third, have a post-war political plan in place before shooting the first bullet. In my interviews of Bush II administration officials like Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor, and Condi Rice, the Secretary of State, they told me that one of the mistakes they made, and one of the mistakes that was unfortunately repeated here, is that before the first shot is fired, know what the post-war plan will be. Military action is by definition disruptive. There needs to be an achievable political plan, in this case, to have a non-Hamas government in place to provide basic services and security and manage the rebuilding of Gaza. This does not exist to this day, and it was one of the reasons that Generals Gantz and Eizenstat left the war cabinet. Next, have a plan to convince the civilian non-combatants that by displacing Hamas, they'll have a better life. Hamas cannot be defeated by military means alone. There has to be a marriage of military power and political action. General Petraeus, who helped turn around the Iraq War, told me that the basis for doing so was what he called clear an area, hold an area from terrorists, but also build an area and build a structure in which non-combatants feel that they will have a better life. He had a sign in his office saying, how many Iraqi civilians did we help today? That's not been a goal of the Israeli government so far. So where do we go from here? My belief is that Israel's real security comes from placing Gaza into a broader regional context and having Israel embedded in a US-led coalition of moderate Sunni Arab states for military, intelligence, and economic security to combat Iran, Israel's greatest existential threat, and its so-called axis of resistance with its proxies. Israel can become a key member of such a coalition with many of the moderate Arab states with whom it already has peace agreements. That is with Egypt, with Jordan, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and the crown jewel being Saudi Arabia, which was poised to join the Abraham Accords before the October 7 attack. And indeed, that is one of the reasons I believe there was such an attack. In August of 2023, for example, Saudi Arabia had already begun entering into public economic agreements with Israeli companies through their non-Israeli subsidiaries. But after the war, having normalized relations with Saudi Arabia and enlisting these moderate Arab states will require the Israeli public to make a very tough choice: to go it alone and trying to fix Gaza and face Iran in the future, or providing what these moderate Arab states require as a condition of being part of this coalition, and that is some timetable and perspective for an eventual Palestinian state. Not tomorrow, but something that will come in some timetable consistent with Israeli security needs. There's already a promising beginning under the Abraham Accords. Between 2020 and 2023, non-defense and non-gas trade with Israel's Arab neighbors total over $4 billion. And when you add defense and cyber, it totals over $12 billion, 12% of Israel's its defense exports for that year. Since the war in Gaza began, however, much of the private sector cooperation has either been put on hold or only proceeded under the table. Despite this bleak current state of affairs, I believe that there are meaningful indications that Israel's prospects for regional economic integration will significantly brighten after the war ends in three areas. First, a regional approach to rebuild Gaza and its day after governance. The UAE has recently publicly, just in the last week, indicated it would participate in such an effort. Second, a regional defense to counter Iran. The Biden administration has bolstered regional cooperation on air and missile defense and enabled closer coordination between Israel and its Sunni neighbors, as we saw on April 13th when Iran tried to attack Israel directly. And third, and most transformational, would be Israeli-Saudi normalization. Crown Prince MBS has continued to signal his willingness to enter a Saudi-US-Israeli mega deal. But again, all of this will not come free. Israel will have to confront the Palestinian challenge to make this a reality, which has bedeviled Israeli politics for decades and has become even more difficult since October 7, as public support in Israel has vastly declined for a Palestinian state out of fear that a Palestinian state would become a terrorist state. Yet Israel must not isolate itself. It has a chance of joining a coalition which would transform its own security, its own future into the 21st century and beyond. It should not lose this historic opportunity to integrate itself in the region but it must do so again with the recognition of finding a way to deal with the Palestinian issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stu, for those remarks. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you. It's always interesting when you go third after two speakers because whatever you plan to come in and say, you now have a different context in which to say it. And I think both Morgan and Stu, I think offered, very interesting perspectives. I want to try a slightly different approach, not only because I'm going third, but because it just makes sense to me. I want to start with talking a little bit about what Bibi's agenda is going to be when he comes here. I want to put it in some perspective to begin with. I have no doubt that when Bibi was planning this trip, or at least when he knew he was going to be coming, he saw this as a major opportunity to sort of offer an explanation of Israel's story as it relates to October 7th and the aftermath. One of the realities in Israel today is that for almost all Israelis left to right, this is still October 7th. It's still October 7th because of the hostages. It's still October 7th because there's really not been an explanation of why the IDF was, in a sense, so slow to respond on October 7th. It's still October 7th because there's been no real accountability, not in the military and not politically. So when the body politic is reflecting that it's still October 7th and the rest of the world is treating October 7th as if it's a memory, you have a problem. And he sees, I think he believed he had a huge international platform when he was coming to speak to the US Congress. I think that's still going to inform what he says. Unfortunately, the context has changed because of the politics here. The ability to capture massive attention by speaking to the Congress would have looked different a week ago than it looks now. There just isn't the capacity in this town to be focused on his speech the way it might have been before. That's not going to change what he says. And I think what he says, first of all, and I think Morgan, you said it, and Stu, you also referred to 2015, but Morgan, you actually drew kind of a distinction. I think you're right. Bibi will approach this speech completely differently than that one. First, he was coming at that time because he was opposed to what was emerging on the JCPOA. But also people tend to forget this was 2 weeks before his election. So anybody who thinks that that speech was geared only to Iran and not to his domestic audience isn't paying attention to Israel and how a prime minister, especially this prime minister, was prepared to operate. Now he's coming in a totally different context. It's a context where the U.S. has been there for Israel in a way that nobody else has been. The U.S. has been the only one to stand with Israel since October 7th. It isn't to say there has been total agreement, but the truth is there has been protection of Israel in the Security Council. Even the Security Council resolution, Morgan, you referred to, was one that had very limited implications in terms of follow-up action. And the reality is the U.S. has been supporting Israel both politically, psychologically, and militarily, and not just in a passive way. Stu, you referred to the night of April 13th. Israel had to intercept over 300 projectiles that were fired at it by Iran. 100 of those were intercepted by the U.S. under the central command with the U.K., with the French, with the Jordanians, and with the help of others, including the Saudis and the Emiratis, because there is an integrated air and missile defense network now, meaning this is no longer an abstraction. If Israel had to intercept all 300 by itself, it would have been less successful. Its defense was nearly flawless, but it wasn't strained as far as it would have been strained. It wasn't pressed as far as it would have been pressed if there was an additional 100 that it had to intercept at the same time. So he's going to come, I think, with real grace notes. He's going to thank the president. He's going to want to emphasize that Israel is an American interest, not a Republican or a Democratic interest. He's going to emphasize the idea that Israel has always been a nonpartisan, a bipartisan issue. So he's going to take the high road in terms of what he has to say. But he also still has an agenda. And the agenda is to try to reshape to the extent he can the narrative that is out there. the narrative has shifted exclusively to the death and destruction in Gaza, and not to what happened on October 7th, and not to the implications of October 7th for Israel and its future and its body politic. You know, when Stu, you say that the most Israelis today, they don't want to hear the term Palestinian state. The reason they don't want to hear the term Palestinian state is because they're still living October 7th, and they think a Palestinian state will be led by Hamas. So for them, the trauma of October 7th is still quite alive. And he's going to come and he's going to remind everybody of what happened on October 7th. He will have at least one of the released hostages with him. He will talk about the kidnapping. He will talk about the brutalization. He will talk about the killing exclusively, almost exclusively, of civilians. He will talk about the rapes. He will remind everybody of who Hamas is. And he will remind everybody that no country in the world would accept having a neighbor like that next to them. No country would live with that. So he will be telling a story designed to remind everybody of what Israel is contending with. Now, I think he will also want to send a message about how what Israel is doing is fighting an enemy that is not only the American enemy, but it's really the enemy of most of the civilized world. And he will also probably remind them, think of the reality, maybe the need to change international humanitarian law. There is a world that Israel is facing, that we have faced as well, where you have non-governmental actors, terrorist actors, that embed themselves in civilian populated areas, that treat their populations as human shields, that act as if their populations have agreed to be martyrs when they have not signed up for that. And they challenge those who they threaten to kill, to come after them, and therefore have to kill large numbers of civilians or do nothing. And if they kill large numbers of civilians, they know how that shifts the weight of public opinion internationally. And he says this is a challenge that Israel's facing, but it's a challenge that the US and others will face as well. Now, he'll do that in part also because he wants to discredit the idea of what the ICC and the ICJ are doing vis-a-vis Israel. And by the way, this is an important message for him to be conveying. Now, I don't think he's just going to be telling that story and just emphasizing the US-Israeli relationship. Morgan, as you said, I think you're completely right. He will emphasize the durability of this. He will, I think one challenge that he has is with his current government, emphasizing shared values is not so easy given the behavior, the words, the actions of Ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but he will still emphasize that. I think he will do a couple of additional things as well. I think one of the things he will do is he will emphasize that Israel is succeeding. Stu, this gets to your point. You have to be able to define success. It's true for a long time he spoke about total military victory, which is a slogan and not an objective. But I think he will talk about how Israel's succeeding. He will talk about how Hamas as a military organization really doesn't exist anymore. It might still be a militia. It might still have people under arms. It might still be able to pose threats, but it's not a military anymore. And he will talk about what's important to ensure that it can't reconstitute itself. The more he does that, the more I think he gets into being able to define what is achievable success. And I think actually, in reality, Israel may not be that far from it. That's certainly where the Israeli military thinks. And this brings me to the issue of the hostages. He will certainly talk about not only the hostages, but a hostage deal. He'll emphasize this is an objective, just as ensuring that Hamas can never again threaten Israel. But I think here we see that the conversations with the administration will be very heavily, certainly with the president, will be very heavily focused on getting a hostage deal. The Biden administration has looked at a hostage deal as setting in motion a series of steps. You'll have a ceasefire, at least a phased approach to ceasefire. You'll have a pause. That pause will allow you to create a structure for delivering humanitarian assistance and making it and being able to ensure it's secure. That pause will allow you to pursue the Saudi normalization deal. That in itself could also lead to an end to the war. The IDF is at a point where they think not only can you do the hostage deal, but I think they're also thinking in terms of you have to do that deal because the IDF believes they failed in their most fundamental responsibility on October 7th. And they don't want to fail for a second time where the only hostages who come back now are not alive. For them, that would be a fundamental failure and a fundamental failure of the fundamental social contract that the state of Israel has with its citizens. So they feel this is a time to do this deal, and they believe that they can cope with some of the issues that the prime minister is raising. Now, why is the prime minister raising these issues? One, because when it comes to the issue of ensuring that the Philadelphia corridor and Rafah is shut down so there is no smuggling, or at least you stop the smuggling, that's a legitimate issue. Ensuring that armed Hamas cannot go back to the north is a legitimate issue. The IDF believes that they have answers for each of those. The administration has been talking extensively with Egypt to produce what will be not just an understanding, but mechanisms on the ground, including sensors on the ground, maybe with a 24/7 monitoring facility where the Israelis would be. The IDF seems to see that as a vehicle for being able to solve this. The point is, Bibi is juggling between the pressures that he faces from the families, from the IDF, but also from a conflicting set of pressures from his own parts of his own coalition, including, by the way, segments within Likud. There was, he got a memo from members of Likud this week against the emerging deal. At the same time, you have the Minister of Defense, who is a member of Likud, allowing him for, in a sense, authorizing the negotiators to go back to Qatar to try to do this deal. So he increasingly is going to be facing a choice. It's not a simple one for him, but I think the weight of saving the hostages and the success so far in terms of weakening Hamas and getting understandings from us on ensuring that you can cut off Hamas in terms of the smuggling of weapons. We should be organizing internationally to cut off the money, and we should ensure there are mechanisms that are put in place to guarantee that reconstruction is going to take place without a diversion of materials to Hamas. I think we're on I think this will be a focal point of what the discussions are in private. It'll be very interesting to see what Bibi decides to do when he goes back. As noted, the summer session of the Knesset goes out on July 28th. Very hard to bring a prime minister down when the Knesset is out, and that gives you until at least the beginning of November. So there may be this moment, and I will just conclude with this thought. In an interesting, ironic way, the fact that President Biden has pulled out frees him up. One of the things he said is he's going to focus on his responsibilities. Well, it frees him up. And it probably sends a message to the Saudis, this is the moment as well. And I have no doubt that his conversations with the prime minister on Thursday will also focus very heavily on the issue of we can do this deal. And this deal, and this sort of gets at what you were saying, Stu, this deal allows us to take a strategy that is already not an abstraction because of what we showed on the night of April 13th, April 14th, and turn this into a reality. You're facing 7 fronts against Iran and the proxies and its proxies on your own. Maybe you can do it, but at a very high cost as part of a regional coalition. This is a regional coalition that actually offers what I call promise and a coalition of resilience versus the axis of misery, which is what the Iranians basically embody. So I think there is a moment, and I think there's a good chance this will be the focal point in private between the president and the prime minister. We'll see what emerges from the trip, especially in the aftermath when Bibi goes back to Israel.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think we really heard 3 great presentations, a variety of perspectives. And I want to ask each of you, and Dennis, I want to start with you on this one, let's just cast the trajectory forward a bit. Let's, for the sake of this conversation, let's assume a couple things. Netanyahu gives a speech that is more unifying. He said so right at the tarmac in Israel before he took off, that was the tone he wanted to strike. And we've been hearing from the U.S. officials and from the White House that is kind of what the administration is expecting. So let's, for purposes of this conversation, let's assume it's a speech that no one could call partisan in any way. Let's also assume that the first phase of the hostages, and again, for our people who are watching this, that it's a multi-phase thing. I mean, two key phases, a third phase too, which is more about dead bodies. But, the idea is to get 33 out now on the hostages. Some will not be alive. Some will. We're going to see if this thing really moves. There's going to be what I would call proximity talks, dealing with Israel and Hamas going over name of prisoners that would be released as part of this hostage deal. And let's assume that it's maybe a coincidence, but it happens to coincide with the Knesset going on recess, where there could be no confidence vote. I mean, it could be technically, but as you said, Dennis, correctly, very hard for it to be the next 3 months. So the news gets a little more optimistic in a certain way, of hostages coming out, the first phase. The second phase is going to be harder because we don't really see Sinwar's interest in letting male soldiers out who are his human shields in these tunnels. But let's say the first phase happens. So, and that keeps also with the president's kind of what he said yesterday to reporters or something like, this is a priority for me as I finish my term, is getting these hostages out. He's going to be meeting with hostage families, American hostage families also this week. And then there's a question of the campaign. And so what I'm trying to look at is these like three kind of entry points. Prime Minister exceeds expectations. Some people think it'll be divisive. And what if, it's a more of a unifying speech, some movement on hostages, and maybe not complete movement, but phase one. And then there's the campaign. So I'm just trying to think, how do the different parties, Dennis, I'm starting with you, and as someone who served actually in administrations with both parties, but how do you think both parties distill these events? A good Bibi speech, hope on the hostages, but then the campaign trail comes, and Morgan said, I think correctly, that the public's focus is more inward right now, inflation, immigration, things like that. So how does the Israeli-Palestinian issue, how does that issue play itself out during the campaign? I know it's a lot to chew on, but our time is limited, so I felt like I got to get all three of the data points in at once.
So, but this was kind of what I was getting at. Think about it from the standpoint of the president and the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. They now know they have a finite period left. And in a lot of ways, that can be liberating for them. It doesn't mean that Biden will be indifferent to the campaign, doesn't mean he won't do some campaign stops, but they are going to collectively focus on what can we achieve. And this is a priority for them. So given that preoccupation, that priority, they're going to throw themselves into this. And Bibi will have to decide. I mean, he clearly faces pressures from within the coalition, but he has this period, this opening, where, he can make some choices. And you focus correctly on the issue of getting the hostage deal, because that's where everybody is right now. And you're probably right. Sinwar seems to be more open than previously, although one of the concerns I've had all along on the strategy is that when you make Sinwar the arbiter of success, you're in a position where it's pretty hard to guarantee you can get anything. And that's why I was sort of also raising the issue. There's two different ways to think about this. One is you get the hostage deal, and everything sort of falls into place. The other is Sinwar at the last minute decides not to do it. But then Israel can be in a position where they can define success anyway. If Israel was in a position, if Bibi were in a position where he said, they're no longer a military, we've destroyed at least more than half of their entire military infrastructure, meaning weapons depots, weapons production sites, weapons labs, half at least of the tunnels. Very hard for them to reconstitute. And now we have mechanisms that will guarantee they can't reconstitute. So we're prepared to say we have succeeded. Now, if he does that, pretty hard for Sinwar in that circumstance to then say, okay, we're not releasing the hostages, even though Israel's prepared to announce an end of the war. Their entire position of Hamas has been, you have to end the war. Now, is that as likely as getting a hostage deal? I'm not so sure. But I think, again, we shouldn't think that the only possibility is a hostage deal and nothing else can be done if there isn't a hostage deal. If you're the administration, you probably don't have a priority more important than this one. And you have a president and the people who are working for him who I think are somewhat freed in a way they would not been if he was having to spend all of his time campaigning.
Okay. Morgan, what do you think?
Sure. So I appreciate the optimism about President Biden running through the tape and being in legacy mode here, and really trying to achieve a deal with the Saudis. I think the first branch, Congress, may have other. Well, they have a say. The Senate specifically has a say here, and if MBS indeed does want a defense treaty with the United States, you need 2/3 of the Senate to approve that. That is 67 senators, and I think Biden actually has a Democrat problem in that respect. Of course, I think we're also taking a look at MBS here. Does he actually want to work with the Biden administration, or is he going to expect a Trump administration might be an easier one to work with?
Can a Trump administration produce a treaty? They got 67, given the Democratic views.
If the Senate takes control, if the Republicans take control of the Senate, I think that becomes easier.
What do you think about a lame duck session?
I think it's going to be tough. I think Democrats are severely opposed to MBS as a personality, but whether a second Trump administration would be able to negotiate and give Dems, something. I don't know what that is, but if they can give them something, Trump is a very transactional character himself. So I do wonder if Republicans do take control of the Senate, and if Trump is able to find a way to give Dems something, at least enough Democrats to get a defense treaty over the line. I think we can get there. I'm more optimistic in that case.
But you do think, just to be clear, Morgan, that if the president does produce this, and this is, like a parlor game in Washington, to get to that requisite 67. I mean, the Lindsey Graham thesis was always only Biden can do this because he's like Nixon going to China. He could bring Democrats along in a way that a Republican can't. Do you think that the Republicans would go along if he could produce Democrats?
If there is a Trump administration, I guarantee you Senator Graham would say only Trump can do this. I think, Senator Graham is perfectly willing to work with the hand that he's dealt. And he himself is a bit of an optimist in that respect. I do think too that, look, the Abraham Accords, were started under President Trump. I think the Biden administration has really done a laudable job in trying to further sort of that crown jewel with Saudi Arabia. Time's running out though, and I think the stopwatch is really going to hit stop soon.
Okay. All right, Stu, your thoughts?
Well, first, let me take the campaign. I've been involved in presidential campaigns since 1968, more losing than winning. But I can say that for this campaign, it will be inflation, the price of eggs, and the immigration issue much more than foreign policy. I think Gaza will not be a major issue on the agenda, nor, unfortunately, will Ukraine, while it should be. But I do think this. I think that the key to try to sustain what may be a unifying speech is for Israel, Dennis, to do more on humanitarian aid, to get more aid in, not to have constant calls by the UN that there's starvation. That is really tremendously important. Second, one of the things I found in doing my book, and you in yours, is that if you try to get too much out of an agreement, the whole thing can collapse. So if you want to go for a first phase, that's possible, but even there, it's extremely difficult because what Sinwar and Hamas want is some assurance that the ceasefire will be more than just 4 to 6 weeks, that there'll be a permanent ceasefire. And Bibi can't tolerate that and shouldn't, that there has to be a realization that they can continue to go after Hamas. And that divide may complicate getting a hostage deal tremendously. So the first phase seems enticing, except the question is what happens between the first and second phases, and that's where a lot of the problems have arisen. It's still possible to do, but I think very difficult. And third, on the Saudi piece, given the fact that Congress will itself adjourn very shortly, and the focus will be on re-election, getting a Saudi deal done would require a leap of faith by the Saudis that they can assure that they can get a treaty done. They don't know what the results of the election were going to be. It would be a real roll of the dice for them. And I think more likely is to try to get them back to where they were pre-October 7, which is beginning to lay the foundation to do more on the economic side, which was already being put in place. But I think trying to go all the way to a treaty would be, for them, a real reach. It is obviously an objective that the administration will want to have as a great legacy, but whether or not the Saudis will want to participate in that with the uncertainties of what will happen in November is, to my mind, very questionable.
David, can I just raise
sure.
two issues? One, Stu, just on the negotiations, the Israelis made a big move. This is what led to President Biden giving the speech he gave on May 31. The move was that in phase one, starting on day 16, you begin a negotiation for a permanent ceasefire. Those negotiations actually continue, even if they're not achieved, into the second phase. The big move the Israelis made was creating for the first time a linkage between the first and second phase, which in effect guaranteed you'd have at least a 3-month pause. So
that is true, but it's also true that Sinwar, who it appeared was going to accept that, has not.
He walked back, but then the reason things have moved forward and you see optimism now is that Hamas now has again gone back to the position it first had. In February, their position was that the first phase could begin without a commitment to a permanent ceasefire up front.
It was the delinking of the two phases that I think has given optimism that at least the first phase can begin.
Yeah. And this would reinforce, by the way, the point that I've made in my book on other negotiations. For example, the Good Friday Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
The Good Friday Agreement, which was monumental in terms of ending the civil war between the nationalists and the unionists, Catholics and the Protestants, actually didn't resolve the two major issues,
right,
which is what was the future of Northern Ireland,
right,
part of the Irish Republic or part of Great Britain, and what do you do with the arms for the militias? But you build a certain confidence. So if, in fact, we can get the two parties to that point where there's a sort of understanding that negotiations can continue indefinitely, but that Hamas won't attack, and you have a sort of ceasefire in fact, if not in writing, then progress can be made.
All right, let me just bring us back to the here and now with, these, and I know this is on the minds of a lot of our viewers, watching this, is they're seeing all the shifts going on in Washington about, it looks like Kamala Harris is going to be the nominee. And their question is how much continuity and discontinuity are we going to see when it comes to the Middle East platforms as it relates to Israel, and not, even not directly Israel, but U.S. policy towards the Middle East? How much continuity, how much has this race been shaken up? Or is it basically these are the same policy positions on both sides, on both the Democrat and Republican side? Maybe I'll start with you, Stu, on that one.
So one of the concerns I have about the election is that there is the prospect that we will have a isolationist administration, that the Freedom Caucus will prevail, that will be in the mind of a President-elect Trump, if he were to win, that would have dramatic impacts for Ukraine. Could be like a Munich II. It could have dramatic impacts in terms of the Middle East, if in fact there's a withdrawal. On the other hand, at least with respect to the Middle East, you do have the chance of a continuity you would not see on climate change, you won't see in Ukraine, you won't see on NATO, you won't see on EU, you won't see on trade. And that is that the president will want to seal, a President Trump will want to seal, as would a President Harris, the last crown jewel of the Abraham Accords, and that is Saudi Arabia. There, I think there will be bipartisan consensus to do so. And I think that with that bipartisan consensus, it is possible to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree. On the other hand, if there is a withdrawal from the Middle East as well, which I would not anticipate, as there will be in European relations in Ukraine, that sends a terrible signal to the rest of the world that we can't be dependent upon. And I hope and pray that will not be the case. Again, the one exception to isolationism may be the Middle East, because every president will want to preside over a major ceremony on the South Lawn with Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords and sealing, as we were saying, Dennis and Morgan, a real coalition against the Iranian axis of resistance. But that again, and I make this point, Dennis, that you didn't quite address it, and maybe you can, it will require a hard choice by the Israeli public, because the Saudis are not going to do this for free.
Right.
There is going to have to be some perspective on the Palestinians, not tomorrow, but there has to be some kind of timetable for it. And can Bibi do that and keep his current coalition together? Probably not.
Probably not. But what I would say is there's a tendency to sort of say, look, there can be a Palestinian state provided Israel's security is guaranteed. That for me sounds a little bit too much like a slogan. I think it has to be translated into something that's meaningful. I prefer a formula that basically says Palestinians are a people and they have a right to self-determination, but with self-determination comes responsibilities. With rights come responsibilities and accountability. All too often, we see people talk about a Palestinian state without any responsibilities on the Palestinian side. You know, how do you build a set of benchmarks that start, for example, with how about the Palestinians having to commit themselves to coexistence and reject the idea of resistance, armed resistance, something that has been a continuing part of the Palestinian narrative? How about committing to the idea there'll be no militias? How about committing to
not paying families who lose?
Well, the pay for slay. I mean, the point is, there at some point there has to be a rejection of Hamas. They can't. It's not just that Israel is fighting Hamas. There has to be a rejection of that ideology. If they can continue to define what the Palestinian identity is, then you're never going to be able to persuade the Israeli public. And by the way, you shouldn't be able to persuade us. So we should be in favor of a Palestinian state, but with a set of benchmarks, behaviors, and actions that have to be met. Then you can talk about a state, talk about a Palestinian state, but talk about it in terms of rights and responsibilities. Then I think you have much more of a chance to affect the Israelis.
Stu, let me just bring it back to the campaign for a second, because again, I'm just trying to anticipate what's on the mind of our listeners. And we know as think tankers, at least us on the staff side, we don't claim that we have this knowledge of people's positions on that we know on what is public, what isn't. But how much is Harris going to continue Biden, as you see it, when it comes to Middle East policy? That's what I think a lot of people want to know. And you're a veteran here of this town on so many Democratic administrations. You probably know her. I mean, what can you say to people about continuity and discontinuity inside the Democratic Party?
Well, there is, as I mentioned at the very outset of my talk, a tremendous partisan divide. And young progressive Democrats are extremely vocal and unfortunately extremely anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. Those are pressures that will be on a Harris administration. However, the kinds of officials she is likely to appoint or reappoint are likely to be those imbued with the general mainstream democratic support of Israel, which we've seen with Secretary of State Blinken, which we've seen with Jake Sullivan, which we've seen with President Biden. So I don't expect any sort of major lurching away from Israel or some new pro-Palestinian policy coming from a Harris administration. I do not see that, even with the pressures that will come from the left, because again, the foreign policy brains and hardware of those who serve in democratic administrations will remain the same.
Thank you. Morgan, I want to turn to you, which
Can
is
I answer this question?
yeah,
first,
for
specifically?
sure. But can I just ask the broader thing and then do what you like?
Please.
Which is some wonder if a Trump administration in a second term, is going to be fundamentally different than his Middle East policy in a first term, in that second term presidents don't have the same sets of pressures that they can't get reelected. And and maybe we also respond to Stu on when he talked about the fear of an isolationist presidency, and then feel free to respond to his earlier remarks as well.
Sure, I'll combine the two questions together for you. So I think it's no secret that President Biden he has said himself, he's a proud Zionist. He's a longtime supporter of Israel. And his poll numbers actually suffered from it on the left. We saw, particularly among Gen Z voters who are not as supportive as Israel as Biden is, or as many sort of mainstream Democrats. We saw President Biden really suffer in his poll numbers, specifically in states like Michigan, where you had the uncommitted vote turn out 10% uncommitted voted for Biden, or voted against Biden, essentially. We've seen far left progressives have actually applauded Harris's nomination, or at least presumed nomination, because they see her taking a different approach here. Specifically, I mean, she has been very forward-leaning on a ceasefire, and she has been a vocal critic of what she has seen as Israel's heavy-handedness in Gaza. So I do think we will see a very different approach towards Israel. I mean, for example, I think it's quite telling. Stuart mentioned this as well, but the fact that she's not going to be presiding as President pro tempore while Bibi is here, I think it really demonstrates where her priorities sit, right? She's going to be in Indiana speaking at a sorority event, as opposed to being at an event that she has a responsibility to attend, given her position, and given October 7th, the very close relationship with Israel, she has a responsibility to be here, and she's not. She's missing in action. Specifically on Trump, though, I do think we see, and I agree with Stuart, in the sense that President or Trump, if he is given a second term, will have a huge opportunity in the Middle East. He will be able to seize the momentum that he built under his first term, what President Biden has done under his term, and build off that and move towards what we would hopefully see as a Saudi deal with Israel. I do think you will see a non-interventionist approach here. Of course, when it comes to Ukraine, it's been no secret that President Trump would like to see a ceasefire there, and thinks, he has said before, and I'm paraphrasing, that if he were president, he'd solve this in one day, right? J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee, of course, has taken a very non-interventionist approach, but I don't think we'll see, a Vice President Vance anywhere near foreign policy. I think what will be more telling is sort of who is put in positions of Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, and the like. So I do think there will be opportunities for President Trump to flex a robust national security in some respects while pulling back in others, and particularly hitting our European friends quite
Morgan,
hard.
and then I want to give
Stuart
a chance.
I want to add one other thing.
But I promise I'll give you a chance to respond. I just want to ask Morgan one Trump related question with his relationship with the prime minister. I mean, people assume the two of them are close, but the truth is, as far as I know, they have not spoken in 4 years, ever since the prime minister called to congratulate Biden on his victory. So how do you see mending that personal relationship? I don't think it's a secret. It's coming out of Jerusalem this week that the prime minister would like a meeting, whether it's in Mar-a-Lago or wherever it is, on the campaign trail, at the Trump Tower in New York, wherever, to see Trump and to try to rehabilitate their relationship. So could you give us some sense of assurance that that relationship is going to be Humpty Dumpty, is going to be put back together again?
Oh, I wish I could promise that, or I wish I could give
Yeah.
you a reassurance of that. No, it's actually something that I myself am quite concerned about. I will note that, Netanyahu has said, he will travel to wherever Trump is to meet with him. And I think it would be a terribly missed opportunity if Trump did not take him up on that offer. I think there was a very warm relationship between Trump and Netanyahu during his first term. Clearly, there's been a break, but nevertheless, I think there's just too much opportunity there for Trump to, let's just say, take it too personally.
Okay. All right, over to you, Stu, to get to respond to some of Morgan's statements.
Well, first of all, what I have liked to see the vice president preside over a joint session, yes, she is meeting with him on a one-on-one, which will be important. But there's also an additional element. Politicians are human beings, and she has a bedmate. That is the second gentleman, who is very strongly pro-Israel and who has led the administration's effort, of which I've been a part, by the way, as head of the Holocaust Museum, of developing the first national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And that personal relationship, husband and wife, I think will also be a reason to be hopeful of continuity of the pro-Israel Biden policy, as well as the points I made, which is that the people who will man the administration of Harris on foreign policy will be the kinds of people that we have now. They come out of the same institutions, they have the same views, and I think that plus the second gentleman, who will then become the first gentleman, will be an important factor in sustaining a pro-Israel policy.
Dennis, over to you. I mean, just, you've been through many campaigns, and how campaigns go versus how people govern are not always the same. Can you give us a sense of where you see continuities and discontinuities in campaigns on both sides, and how you see, what does that mean in terms of worldview and governing after a campaign?
Look, it's a very important and interesting question. And I think what you heard from both Morgan and Stu suggested, at least as I listened carefully to each, both reflect a kind of hopefulness about what they will see, a little bit of uncertainty about what they will actually see. Campaigns are not necessarily indicative of what policies will be. You run campaigns to win elections. You don't necessarily run campaigns to define what your policy will be. I very much hope that the Freedom Caucus is not a significant formulator of policy should Trump win. I think, American leadership in the world is the key to having stability. Without it, the world becomes an even more dangerous place. And I say that on the Freedom Caucus, and I would say, some of the progressive views, if we were to see them emerge, I'd be concerned about that as well. Progressives tend to define the U.S. as being the source of conflict in the world, and you look at places like Ukraine, or you look at Hamas's behavior, it's pretty clear it's not the U.S. Or its allies are the source of that. So I've often felt that the political spectrum, it's not really left to right. It's sort of like this. The progressives and the Freedom Caucus, their actual prescriptions for foreign policy are not that different. They're both inclined towards withdrawal. Having a consensus on the role of the United States as a leader internationally, I think is critical. Now, clearly, J.D. Vance comes from a different school. I think when it comes to President Trump, if one can portray that American leadership is necessary for America to win, since he tends to focus on winning, I think if we can shape and frame what is required in foreign policy in terms of his understanding that this can be a win for us, and withdrawal actually ends up being a lose for us, maybe there can be the kind of continuity that the two of you, I think, not only are talking about, but you would each like to see.
Yeah. Well, just to follow up on this point a little bit, and Dennis, I know you talked about this a lot. We at the Washington talk about this a lot, and it's kind of been lost because, again, as Stu says, and I said in one of my questions, inflation, immigration, basic things like that often shape campaigns. But what often is not discussed, maybe in the campaign, but a question is beyond the campaign, whoever wins, is the question of Iran. And that is something that we don't hear about a lot. The Iranian nuclear issue is something that we don't hear about these days. You could say, well, October 7th has kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room. But who is the ring of fire, as Qasem Soleimani famously called those 7 fronts that Israel's now has to deal with, most recently the Houthis, and that is Iran. And I'm trying to just look for clues in both camps here about how they will deal with Iran going forward with their isolationism. People want to turn inward or retrench from the Middle East, so look towards Asia. What happens how does the U.S. deal with Iran and its proxies after the campaign, even if the issue doesn't figure into the campaign itself? Dennis, maybe we'll start with you, and then these will be final comments. So feel free to just, as we wrap up.
This gets back to, I think, what we were just talking about in terms of having the U.S. continue to assume a leadership responsibility. If there had been a second Biden term, this is a president who said Iran will not get a nuclear weapon on my watch. And the truth is, given
he also says superpowers don't bluff.
Right, but the trajectory of the Iranian nuclear program could actually mean they would have gotten without a change in direction from the administration. So if there's a Harris administration, her administration will have to contend with the reality that Iran is accumulating highly enriched uranium and probably will have about 10 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium in 2025. That already begins to create a kind of shield behind which they can engage in coercion. You need to have a strategy that raises the price to them in the region, and you need to have a strategy that makes it very clear to them that they are risking the entire investment they've made in their nuclear infrastructure over the last 40 years. They need to understand the risk that they're running, and this isn't a rhetorical risk.
100%.
And that's true for whoever emerges.
Okay. And Morgan, over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much. This was a very thoughtful panel, and I thoroughly enjoyed this past hour with y'all. So this is I would say, a highly consequential visit for Prime Minister Netanyahu, but I think he's going to have to come back to Washington perhaps sooner than he thinks, perhaps after the election. Keep in mind, we're going to see Congress, about a third of Congress will turn over. Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to have a lot of relationship building to do, whether that is with a Trump administration or whether that's with a Harris administration, and with a new Congress. And so, needless to say, I think that this is a timely visit for the Prime Minister, but yet at the same time, this is a relationship that's going to require a lot of care and feeding moving forward.
Yeah.
So I'm going to bring
the last word.
I'm going to bring this back to Iran, but let me say that one of the great problems of foreign policy in the United States is its discontinuity. There's discontinuity, for example, on climate change, depending on who wins the elections. We're either in or we're out of Paris Agreement. There are discontinuities possible on Ukraine. There are discontinuities on NATO. The discontinuities on international trade, where we're talking about across-the-board tariffs that might be imposed. But on Iran, let me make the following contrast, because the discontinuity there was so ghastly a mistake. When we lost the election overwhelmingly in 1980 to Ronald Reagan, he had campaigned against SALT II, the treaty that reduced nuclear arms with the Soviet Union. And yet, because he wanted continuity in foreign policy, Ronald Reagan followed it to a T, as did the Soviets, for its entire duration, and then built on it with a START treaty for deeper cuts. Contrast that with what happened in the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. I know all the faults with it. I headed a study by the Atlantic Council for it, but it did box in the nuclear program for 15 years. It led to a reduction, Dennis, in enriched uranium. It eliminated the plutonium plant in Iraq. It cut out 2/3 of the centrifuges, and there was compliance. By withdrawing and talking about maximum pressure, that maximum pressure has now led Iran to the brink of being a nuclear power. And I think we're now in a situation where that discontinuity is going to face the new administration. Now, there is the following. With the Iranian election, a relative, and I underscore relative, reformer won, who's talked about trying to open doors to the West. That may provide, although presidents don't have, it really is Khomeini who controls and the Revolutionary Guard, the foreign policy, but it may open the possibility of going back to the JCPOA and seeing if we can again box in that nuclear agreement. But it's very difficult once the jack is out of the box to put it back in. So I think that the next president, whether it's Harris or Trump, is going to have a major issue to face. My guess is that Iran wants to be at the lip of being a nuclear power, not go over that line, but be able to break through within weeks and stay there. That will then confront Israel and the U.S. with a major decision of what to do.
Well, I really want to thank these panelists, all three of you, really for a very thoughtful, very wide-ranging conversation about this moment we're in with the Netanyahu visit, all the changes going on in Washington with the presidential election, what could be possible trajectories beyond the campaign. It has been really wonderful being with all three of you. I want to thank all three of you, Morgan, Stu, and Dennis. And I just want to hope all of you will follow us in the Washington Institute as we keep following these issues, whether it's U.S.-Israel relations, whether it's Israeli-Arab relations, whether it's Iran, whether it's the Houthis. There's so many, and many of my colleagues working on so many other questions. There's so much to write about, and I hope you follow us on our website. I could say I just restarted this week the season of the podcast Decision Points with a discussion with Dennis, also a wide-ranging discussion on U.S.-Israel relations. I hope you look at that. But there's so much to follow with my, really excellent colleagues, and it's just a fantastic place. And I hope you'll stick with us at the Washington Institute for future webinars. So to all of you, wish you a good summer afternoon, and to our panelists, thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much.